leave of absence from my PhD right now. I have had a whole bunch of art projects to focus on since I came back to Nova Scotia. And it's been such a pleasurable break for me to focus on just art and, nothing besides art, nothing else. I'm really just putting all my energy into my projects, and it's been making me really happy. And I'm happy that I've taken this time for myself. It's been very important to me, and it's been very freeing. It feels quite expansive, and that's exciting. I'm from Unama'ki, which Unama'ki is the Mi'kmaq word for Cape Breton. I'm of settler heritage, mainly Irish and Acadian. My father was adopted, so we don't really know a whole lot about his family, except that he just reconnected with them, and they're from Newfoundland. I haven't met them. It was during the pandemic that all of this unfolded. But I'm from a town that was the main steel center for the country of Canada on the East Coast. And for a long time, it was one of the major steel producing areas in the country. The Sydney Steel Plant was built in 1900 by an American company, and it was like a hugely ambitious political project that was trying to place Cape Breton, interestingly, this is really interesting to me, it was trying to place Cape Breton as this enormous hub of industry for North America in general. And one of the reasons for this is because Cape Breton is placed in the North Atlantic in this position where it can easily access the northeastern states down in America, and it also has great access to Europe and the UK. So there were a whole slew of American interests involved in bringing the steel plant to Sydney and starting this industry there. And one of the reasons that they wanted to start making steel in Sydney is because of the access to coal, to raw materials. So Cape Breton is rich in coal, and coal has been mined there since the late 1600s on a very small scale. Coal was extracted from cliffs at that point in time, so it wasn't a proper mine shaft. It was more of a smaller domestic type of mine that people would gather coal and then use it for their own purposes. It wasn't an industrial pursuit at that point in time. But it's been long known to be coal rich, and so people wanted to harness these natural resources and earn some cash, essentially. So steel came to Cape Breton, and it had a very tumultuous history, because the steel interests up until 1967, when the government of Nova Scotia purchased the steel plant, the steel interests were always owned or held by American or British. So there's always been an imperial aspect, and often the word imperial is used in the title of the holding companies that owned the steel plant from time to time. The steel plant changed hands a lot, and there was a great deal of strife with the workers, especially in the 1920s. And as a result, there was a huge union presence in Cape Breton. They joined up with the United Steelworkers of America, and the coal miners were also a part of this union. So there was a very strong union presence, and the workers felt compelled and supported to fight for their rights because they had a union behind them. But the imperial powers brought in the RCMP, they brought in heavies, just sort of like people who would essentially create violence and chaos to try and force the workers back to the steel plant, back to the coal mines. So there there were like a number of strikes that happened. It was this history of steel and of coal in Cape Breton is deeply conflicted. And so in decades and decades of this conflict happened. And then in 1967, Hawker Siddeley, the American company that owned, maybe it was British, I can't remember, it was an imperial presence. Anyway, they owned the steel plant and they were just going to shut it down. And the steel plant, you have to remember, was the biggest employer in Cape Breton besides the coal mines at this time. So losing the steel plant would have meant that people in industrial Cape Breton would have lost thousands of jobs. So this was devastating for the economy. So in 1967, you had what was called the Parade of Concern, and that was when over 10,000 people from Cape Breton gathered in Sydney and marched through the streets to protest the closure of the steel plant. And as a result, the Nova Scotia government stepped in and purchased the steel plant. And they owned the steel plant until its demise. It stopped producing steel. It slowed down over the decades that the Nova Scotia government owned it. And then in the early 2000s, they stopped producing steel. And then in 2013, there was a park commemorating the steelworkers placed at the site of the former steel plant. But that's only part of the story, because the production of steel requires a process called coking. And coking is when coal is burned at a very, very high temperature to create this dust called coke. It's cooked with, other chemicals, and it produces coke, and coke is used in steelmaking process. So this coking process is incredibly damaging to the environment, and the whole steelmaking process is very, very damaging to the environment, but the coking process particularly so. So due to about 100 years of steelmaking in Cape Breton, there was this enormous toxic waste site. I grew up about a block and a half, a city block and a half from this toxic waste site. My playground that I played on when I was a kid with all my friends was built on landfill that was part of Muggus Creek. Muggus Creek is the old name for what became known as the tar ponds, the Sydney tar ponds. And this was considered to be the largest toxic waste site in North America after the Love Canal. And in 2000, Maud Barlow and Elizabeth May of the, Maud Barlow, you would know from her name from the Sierra Club, and Elizabeth May was the head of the Green Party in Canada. So these two women joined up and they decided to write a book about the experience of some people in Sydney who were living adjacent to the toxic waste site and the disease, the cancers, the different types of cancers and respiratory illnesses that people were experiencing from being exposed to this toxic waste on a daily basis. When I was growing up, the steel plant was running, and every evening the sky was orange. It was a normal thing to have an orange sky. It felt like, when I think about it, when I think back to my childhood, it felt like the sky was always orange. And then when the steel making stopped, it just suddenly disappeared and we didn't have orange skies anymore. It was from the smokestacks of the steel plant. They emitted an orange smoke that was full of dust particles that were found to contain PCBs, polychlorinated biphenyls, and PAHs. Polyaromated hydrocarbons. And these are both known to be carcinogens. So these carcinogens had been around for decades. And as a result, Cape Breton has had and still has the highest cancer rate in the country. So it started earlier. The fight for environmental justice in Cape Breton started with the coal miners and the steel workers in the 80s, when information from tests that had been conducted around the Muggus Creek watershed area revealed that there were quite a number of carcinogens in the waterway, but this information was being suppressed. And it was being suppressed because people were afraid that the steel plant would be shut down or limited in its capacity even further, and that more jobs would be lost. So in Cape Breton, there's kind of been this feeling of like either jobs or health. That's what it felt like. And I think it felt like that for a lot of people. So when Elizabeth May and Maud Barlow came out with this book, it caused a huge sensation. And it also forced the government to really start to examine this issue more deeply. And it, I feel like, empowered citizens in Sydney in some ways to really fight for themselves and for their loved ones, because, you know, I know many people who have died of cancer, just like pretty much everybody that I know from Sydney, because it's so pervasive. It is a part of our lives. So the government was forced to begin to, although they have been denying for decades that the toxic waste has anything to do with the cancer rate in Sydney. This has always been a hugely controversial topic, and there's always been pushback from the government about this. So I feel like it's created this culture in Sydney in some ways of fighting for environmental justice, but at the same time, the people who've spoken out against this, there's been so much pushback over the years that I feel like people just kind of stopped talking about it after a while. And it seems like the government kind of wanted to create this bookend with the park that they placed at the site of the former steel plant and the former toxic waste site. So what happened is that there was a remediative attempt. And over the years, there were a number of remediative attempts to clean up the tar ponds. There were incinerators built, and they had hired the steel workers to come back and help with the cleanup. But what they kept finding was that they couldn't burn these toxic materials at a temperature that was high enough that it wouldn't pollute the air further. So, you know, there was a lot of talk about what they were going to do with this toxic waste. And they came into our schools when I was a kid, and they talked to us about potentially burying the toxic waste. And I remember everybody in my class being like, that doesn't seem like a good idea. But that is what they did, essentially. They dredged the tar ponds, and this was like a thick, black, gooey-looking waterway with oil slick swirls on the top. And in the summertime, when the weather was warm and the air was humid, it just smelled absolutely rotten. The whole north end of Sydney, and that's the neighborhood that I'm from, just smelled absolutely rotten from the tar ponds. So they dredged it, and they isolated what was left by containing it in concrete. And then they put landfill on top, and they created this park space. But next to the playground that I played in when I was a kid, there's a space, it's a train yard, and it was built on landfill, just like the playground that I grew up playing in. So when I was a kid and we were building sandcastles in the playground, if we would dig a moat around our sandcastles, then they would automatically fill up with water. And it was from the waterway. It was leaking, water into our play area. So essentially that was toxic waste that was filling up our moat around our childhood sandcastles. And nobody thought that was a problem. And I mean, even just the fact that our playground in the North End was directly adjacent to the train yard, and it didn't even have a fence to keep us out of the train yard. We walked over there all the time. When I was a kid, we walked over, we would steal cherry bombs, and we would put them on the train tracks so that the train would run over them later and we would hear them explode. Pennies on the tracks, the kind of things that kids do. But it was a tremendously dangerous situation for us. And I feel like that is kind of this theme that runs throughout my life growing up in Cape Breton, and in Nova Scotia, in Canada's ocean playground. There's this dark side, and it's an incredibly beautiful place, but this dark side just gets swept under the rug all the time. And I mean, when industry left, tourism became the new industry. And so it was this way to continue to employ people in Cape Breton, and that's what it became all about, was tourism. So it was almost this Band-Aid. And I mean, you can't have a toxic waste site and be bringing busloads and huge cruise ships full of people into this town with a big, giant, disgusting toxic waste site. So, it was in their interest to clean it up for the tourism, but for us, for the people who lived in this place and played in this place, we were never enough of an incentive to clean up the toxic waste. So the CN rail yard, which was next to the playground I grew up playing on, and is also on landfill, was never remediated. This side of the toxic waste site was never remediated. And so as a result, when I started my PhD work, I wanted to talk about this. In fact, when I started my BFA back in 1999, so I was at NSCAD, Nova Scotia College of Art and Design, from 99 to 2004. I did my BFA there, and I wanted to talk about this at the time, but it was really something that nobody was interested in hearing about, and I felt like I got silenced a lot. I feel like it was the politics of the time, but I felt like I couldn't really start to talk about these things until I started my MFA in 2015, also at NSCAD. There was quite a huge gap in between there. I trained as a goldsmith in Vancouver, and I ran a goldsmithing business for 7 years in that time period. And then I decided that I really wanted to focus on art, and I had these stories I wanted to tell about growing up in this place and having this experience. And I felt like I was finally in a place in my life where I could really tell these stories in the way that I wanted to. So that's what I started with my MFA work, was telling these types of stories, these types of they are working class stories, because I am from a working class place. And as a result, it's a life on the margins. A lot of people I've known have fallen through the cracks. I've lost a lot of people. And deindustrialization, I've been studying this in my PhD. It's a phenomenon that's international. It affects every part of the world, or it will affect every part of the world, because especially as industry moves, it moves into places where it's cheaper to produce whatever it is that you're producing. It starts in America, it starts in Canada, it starts in France or wherever, and then it moves to Mexico, it moves to India, it moves to China, it moves to these places where there are fewer environmental laws or environmental demands to be met, and the labor is cheaper. And there aren't as many, issues around workplace hazards and things like that. So really, it's an opportunist strategy to continue to take advantage of manpower and natural resources without having to really deal with the consequences or think about the things you would have to think about if you were trying to produce these things in a place like France or in a place like Canada or the US, where because of the experience of having industry and losing industry and having these toxic waste sites to have to clean up, there are far more rules and fewer accommodations for big business anymore. In my MFA work, I decided to tackle a brownfield in my neighborhood that had always been abandoned, and it was formerly a dry dock. And a dry dock is a place where ships are built and repaired. And it was a debris field when I explored it. It was debris field my entire life, and I had been going into these types of spaces my entire life with my friends because the North End is a peninsula, and we were just surrounded by these types of former industrial spaces. So it was natural for us to explore these places and to play there and, do kid stuff in there. And as I grew up, I continued to visit these spaces, and I would sometimes collect things. So that's what sort of brought me back into this space. I wanted to go as an adult and as an artist and view it in a different way, think about it in a different way, and think about what it meant to the greater neighborhood and maybe to the city at large. Having these types of industrial spaces, how does it make us feel? What does it make us think about when we're in these spaces? So I spent a lot of time there, and I found it a very reflective space. It became an incredibly important place for me in my practice, and I gathered materials from this place, and all of the materials I gathered were things like broken pieces of floor and rusted chains and bits and pieces of tools and machinery and old bricks that were battered by the sea and rebar and just all of these traces of this past that had existed in this space, but my entire life, it wasn't there. So I put together a show, and I called it Keeper of Industrial Memory for my MFA thesis exhibition. And I had written all these stories about growing up in Sydney, in this deindustrializing place, and experiencing these post-industrial sites, and sort of what it felt like as a kid, what it made you think about, what it made you feel, sort of trying to evoke emotions around not just these places, but around the neighborhood, the working class neighborhood at large, because that is an intrinsic part of this work. So I sort of connected these stories that I would write about my childhood in these places to the objects that I was bringing in from the debris field. And these objects, I would manipulate them. Sometimes I would cast them in plaster so that they became something else entirely that I could attach my own stories to, instead of this piece of history or this historic object that already has stories attached to it. I did other interventions like repair. I found this 50-pound marine chain that was all worn down. It was all worn down. The links were worn down. So I bought brass brazing rods, and I started to build up the links again where they were deteriorated with brass, and it created this striking contrast between the rust and the decay and this new material that was shiny and yellow and felt more precious. So it was this attempt to repair or to reconcile these things in some way. And I didn't know about the study of deindustrialization at this time. And when I applied for my PhD, I didn't know about it either. But what I was talking about was deindustrialization. And it affects not just people's health, their physical health, their bodies, but it affects their mental health too. So when you're growing up in a place where you're essentially being told that you don't matter very much because you're poor, and so it's okay for you to live next to a terrible environmental waste site, you know, it does a number on the way you feel about yourself, the way you view yourself, the importance that you place on your own person. And loss of jobs also has a huge impact on people's perceptions of themselves and where they fit into society. And sometimes, you know, people work a job like the steel plant for decades, and then suddenly it's gone. Or coal miners, it was the same thing. I've done a number of oral histories with former industrial workers in Cape Breton, and I've also read many of them, and the impact from around the world while I was doing my PhD in the study of deindustrialization. And it's the same emotional reactions over and over again. It's the sense of self that people lose. And it trickles down. It starts with themselves, but it trickles out into the greater community. And it disrupts these almost like loose institutions, like community bonds that have been formed over the years, that are created all around these types of spaces. And then when it's gone, these communities, these groups, these support networks also start to disappear. So I've lost a lot of people in my life from suicide. You know, I've known people who are murdered. I've known people who've died of drug overdoses. I've known many people who are addicted to drugs. These are the types of things that you find in places that are deindustrializing. It takes a huge impact on people's souls, essentially. So when I went into my PhD work, this was something that I wanted to address. And I found, and I had been thinking about this somewhat in my master's degree, where when I was in the debris field, I noticed the bounty around me. There was so much vegetation. And I knew, because my parents were sort of like back to the land enthusiasts when I was a child. So I grew up learning how to forage for foods, you know, on a small scale. And my parents had all of these books about going back to the land, living off the earth, self-sufficiency, how to build your own house. There was this great one. It was a Reader's Digest book, and it is to this day a favorite of mine. It's called Back to Basics, and it's kind of like how to do just about anything, you know, on a homestead, let's say. It's very much about self-sufficiency. And I leafed through that book all the time when I was a kid. My mom grew up in Ingonish, which is up in the Cape Breton Highlands, and her father, my grandfather, Albert Doyle, was a fisherman there. And they raised their own food for the most part. They had enormous gardens. He was a fisherman of lobster, salmon, and cod. But in 1992, there was a moratorium on cod and salmon, and that industry was shut down in Nova Scotia. Fishermen couldn't gather those types of fish anymore because there was a detrimentally low stock, and they were afraid that we would lose the stock altogether. So they've been trying to nurture it and bring it back. And these fisheries aren't quite open yet, still to this day. My father at that time worked in a fish plant. I remember he lost his job because Well, there was so much less fish going through the plant that they didn't need as many workers anymore. But my grandparents raised, sometimes they'd raise a cow or a pig, but sometimes my grandfather would hunt a moose. Their lives were very connected to the earth, quite self-sufficient. So, and so learning how to forage things like berries and fiddleheads and whatnot was something that I naturally learned from my extended family and from my own family that I lived with. And so when I was in these spaces, I recognized that it was full of food. There was food all over the place. There were even just oyster shells all over the beach. There was so much bounty that I felt like it was important. So when I started my PhD, I originally was working with detritus, just like I had been in my master's degree. And then I started to think of detritus as not just rusted metal or old tiles or broken bricks or, these things that I found on the ground, but as humans. I felt like the people who lived in this place were being treated like they were detritus, like they were easily discarded. And it made me think about the experience of living in this place further. And it made me think about survival. And it made me think about whose lives are important and whose lives aren't important. And so I started to visit the CN brownfield again. I had spent a lot of time in this space as a child, and I started to go back and walk it. There is a cross there where a boy from my neighborhood, I wrote a story about this. He was killed down near the brownfield on the road that leads to the brownfield. So there's a cross that commemorates his grave there. And I have sort of like a colorful history with this person growing up in the same neighborhood. I wrote about him a few times. And so I like to go visit his little memorial sometimes. And I like to photograph it because I feel like it's kind of symbolic of this place. His death was quite tragic. He died very young. But these places, these brownfields, they're incredibly beautiful because these are overgrown spaces. They're spaces that have lost capitalist value. And so they're kind of these in-between or liminal spaces where they're not really used for anything anymore. They just exist. But if you enter them and really look around or use a different pair of goggles or a different lens when you get into these spaces, then you realize that they're absolutely teeming with life and that you could exist off of what is being offered to you from the earth in this space. You could gather medicine, you could gather food, and you could make useful things, baskets, salt from the water, utensils, tools from shells, from rocks, all of these things. There's so much actually in this space. So I started to explore what was actually in space, the natural things that existed there, and what they could be used for, what they have been used for, and what we would potentially use them for if they weren't growing from earth that was compromised by toxic waste. And that was the big thing that I was trying to sort of talk about or get people thinking about was, would you eat this food if it was gathered from a site that used to host or potentially does? This site was never remediated. We don't know if there's toxic waste here. There could be, very likely. It's this ground is right next to the former toxic waste site. It's on a landfill. So, there was water underneath it that was definitely contaminated by toxic waste. So is this soil contaminated? Are these plants contaminated? And so I joined up with a chef, and I joined up with a foraging expert, because I definitely consider myself to be a novice. I'm still working on my skills, but there's a lot to know. So I joined up with these women, and we spent some time in the brownfield together looking at the plants, and we created a foraging walk, and the chef and I created a menu, a tasting menu based on plants that were available in the brownfield, but that we sourced from outside the brownfield in rural areas where the earth wasn't being compromised or potentially compromised. And I invited people to come. I had 13 people show up for the event one night. It was at 7 o'clock. The idea was we would walk the brownfield together, look at the plants, discuss the plants and their uses. And then at the end, everybody could taste the things that they see around them. And when I talked to people afterwards, or when I told people about this project while I was working on it, the response I got every single time from people was, "You're not going to eat that, right? You aren't going to eat food that you foraged down there. I really hope you're not going to eat that. I don't know if I would eat that if I was you." And this was exactly what I expected, because people feel uncomfortable about this remediative effort and what it didn't encompass. It just felt kind of like a symbolic closure for the controversy, not an actual, attempt to remedy this situation and try to bring some closure and some nurturance or some thought or consideration to the lives that exist around this space at all times. And during this process, I was in a PhD deindustrialization seminar, and I read this paper by Anne-Laure Stoller. It was published in 2010, and it was a journal essay, and it was called Imperial Debris. And in this essay, Stoller talks about imperialism and the things that are left behind by imperialism, and what it means and how it makes people feel, and what constitutes imperial debris. So I started to think about this space and the people and the effects of this place and this process of deindustrialization on the people and the earth. And I came to the conclusion that disease, cancer, toxic waste, these are imperial debris. They're all trickling down from this imperial entity that existed in our midst for about 100 years. So I find this lens of imperial debris to be incredibly useful, and it's been a force in my artistic practice ever since, and I find it just so apt to think of there's this beautiful quote where she talks about scarred people and scarred places, and how these are the effects, the impacts of imperialism. And she's looking at all kinds of different places in the world and the effects of imperialism on these places and how it trickles down to the people and affects their lives. She talks about the atom bomb. She talks about ancient ruins in Cambodia. She talks about resorts down south. This term, this concept of imperial debris can really encompass so much. And in a place like Canada, where we are struggling to come to terms with our settler colonialism and the impacts that has had on the first people, on the Indigenous peoples here, this is a huge undertaking. And it's very difficult, because we have to think about everything that we experience on a day-to-day basis in a different way, from a different perspective, because as settlers, our experience is different from Indigenous peoples. And so, it's our job to do things like decolonize institutions and recognize this land that we occupy and what it means to be here and what our responsibilities are. So I really feel like I thought about stewarding the earth in the past, but through the process of spending more time in the brownfield and thinking about stewardship and our place, our responsibilities in the natural world, and working with Indigenous artists and reading books and papers written by Indigenous peoples, I really feel like this is an opportunity. We're here at this time, in this place, wherever we may be. This is an opportunity for us to learn about the earth, to learn about the world that supports our existence. And I feel like a lot of people don't consider that, but really the things that are growing all around us, these ecosystems, they support our lives. There's this beautiful reflection on toxicity and the natural world called Chernobyl Herbarium. And it's written by Michael Martyr. And its images are by an artist. It's a collaboration between a philosopher and an artist. Michael Martyr is the philosopher, and Tondur is the name of the artist. I can't remember her first name. I think it might be Anais. I can't remember. But in any case, it's this reflection on Chernobyl and the natural world surrounding Chernobyl that's kind of in this state of paralysis where it doesn't decay, it doesn't change because of the toxicity. It just stays the same all the time, and it looks natural, but it's so detrimental to the health of the animals and the other types of fauna or humans who encounter it. And it made me reflect on the things we view as weeds, and the fact that these things we view as weeds, they don't need us to survive, but we do need them to survive. They create our oxygen, they nurture our food, they nurture the ecosystems that give us life. So really, without them, we can't survive. And I think that it feels important to me to make this distinction, to acknowledge that we aren't the center of the universe, and that we really do have to consider the impact that we have on the world around us.
You're making ink and you're making salt. Let's cover that area.
Sure. So this past summer, I was commissioned by the Ecology Action Center and Zupa Theatre, which is an experimental theatre company out of Halifax. And the Ecology Action Center is an ecological institute out of Halifax, Nova Scotia. And they were doing this competition called 50 Things. So they were calling for artists from Nova Scotia to propose projects about a thing, and they had a list of 50 things you could choose from. So I chose coal, and I proposed a little library of forged inks on the former rail line. I'm living in Bridgewater, Nova Scotia right now, which is on the South Shore. It's the town over from Lunenburg, which is where I do my residency. And there, around the South Shore, a lot of the former rail lines have been turned into like recreational trails, so bicycle paths, walking paths, things like that. So to me, when I think of the railway and I think of steel that made the railway, I think of coal, because you need coal to make steel, and I'm from a place where there's both coal and steel. So I chose coal, and I suggested the little library of forged inks on a former railway. So it was on a path, on a walking path. And I wanted the project to be something of a prompt for people to really consider the things that they're seeing around them, because I made the inks out of berries, nuts, leaves, flowers that are local. So I harvested forged for berries, leaves, flowers, and nuts to experiment with in making inks. Because I felt like, for one, I had been focusing on these different aspects of the plants. So their medicinal properties, their edible properties, different ways you could use them in making paper, in making baskets, in making twine and rope, things like of a practical nature. And I wanted something that was just about beauty in some ways. So a lot of the plants that I use to make ink are the same kinds of plants that I would forage for medicine or for edible purposes, but I just used them in a different way. I processed them in a different way. But it's only slightly different, and this is one of the things that I found really interesting about this process, is that you're using all non-toxic ingredients that you would often use when you're preserving foods. And when I foraged for food purposes, a lot of the things that I foraged I would preserve in some way. And I also like that kind of like double entendre of preservation, and the concept of preservation and what this means. So I decided to use the same foraged goods or forged plants to make colors, to make something that's really just for beauty, and to share that with the community. So I proposed the little library of forged inks. And one of the reasons that I thought of a little library is because during the pandemic, I was living in Fredericton, New Brunswick. And that town has about 20 little libraries. So I was reading books exclusively from little libraries for the entire year that I worked there. I would do what I would call a little library crawl with my dog. I'd take her out for a walk all around the town, and we'd stop at different little libraries. And I'd bring the books that I had already read with me and leave them in the library, and I'd take some new ones away to read for the next week or two until we did it again. And it was great. I loved it. I love the concept of little libraries. I photograph them everywhere I go. I have a collection of little library photos. I just love them. So I wanted to make my own little library and share it with the community. And in this case, I made a little library of ink. I made about 50 bottles, small bottles of ink, around 60 milliliters or less. And I stocked this little library that was full of drawers, and I left watercolor paper and a guest book and brushes, and people used it like crazy. I just took it down last week, and I had to restock it with ink because people were not returning it. But they were obviously enjoying it, and I had so many letters left for me in the guest book, and so many pieces of artwork that people shared or that people left behind. Sometimes I started an Instagram account to go with it. So I asked people to take photos of their experiments with the inks and send them to the Instagram account, and then I would post them. But what a lot of people did is they left the artwork behind for me. Some people photographed it and sent it in, and some people actually left it for me. So I have a whole lot of creations that people produced experimenting with the ink and then left behind for me. And I loved it. It was like every time I visited the little library, there was a new surprise waiting for me. And people were surprised and delighted by its existence. And it was just really fun. I really enjoyed it. I have continued to make inks. And I taught a course at the Lunenburg School of the Arts last month on ink making, and I'm going to be teaching it a few more times in the future. But part of the reasoning behind this work is, not just for the fun and for the beauty, but also to make people think about how incredibly amazing the natural world is and how much potential there is out there, and how we should maybe consider it a little bit more.
What about making salt?
Oh, salt, yes. So when I was working in the brownfield in Sydney, the CN brownfield, I was thinking about the different things that we need to exist and how we could get them or where they come from. And I mean, to me, salt is necessary. We need salt to exist. And salt is incredibly useful, but it's also something that's, it's symbolic in some ways. Like I think about Gandhi and the salt wars in India, where, as a way to resist colonialism, people refused to buy salt. They went and they made their own salt. And, also being working class, people are often referred to as the salt of the earth. So to me, there are all these meanings, these different meanings for salt. And I thought, well, I'm here in Lunenburg, I'm right next to the ocean. I can access salt water anytime I want to, and I can definitely make some salt. I will work with the sun. So in my studio, I go down to the waterfront, I get a mason jar full of salt, and then I have a casserole dish, a large glass casserole dish that I pour the salt water into, and I place it in the shaft of light that's coming in the studio window. And as the sun moves throughout the day, I move the dish with the sun, and I document it every time I move it. And over, a couple of days, the water disintegrates and I'm left with salt. And we wouldn't eat the salt because the salt is gleaned from the harbor, which is a working harbor, and it's absolutely full of fishing vessels and trawlers and whatnot. So I don't think it would be a salt that I would want to sprinkle on my food, but still, I made salt. And to me, it was just this symbolic practice that also felt beautiful and kind of effortless. And salt is an incredibly useful thing to have. So the fact that I know how to make salt is just like another skill that I feel like I have given myself. So every time I learn how to do something new with something from the natural world, I feel like I'm giving myself this gift, this new skill, this new amount of information, or this new tool to use.
You are now at Lunenburg School of Arts. Can you talk a little bit about your residency and your show that you have there, your installations?
Sure. So the Lunenburg School of Arts is an arts center in Lunenburg, Nova Scotia, and it is a place that hosts artists in residence. So when I started my residency in September, I have a 3-month residency there. It goes from mid-September until mid-December, when I have a solo show down in their gallery. So when I started, they had 2 artists in residence. I was upstairs in a studio space, and then downstairs in this large open space with a garage door that fronted the street, they had a Mi'kmaq birch bark canoe builder. Todd Labrador is his name, and he is the last birch bark canoe maker in Mi'kmaq, and Mi'kmaq is the term that encompasses the territory of the Mi'kmaq. So that includes Nova Scotia and parts of New Brunswick and New England and Newfoundland. So Todd Labrador built this beautiful birch bark canoe, which we launched down at the space where I gather my water for salt on October 1st. And it was a totally popular, amazing residency that brought in people every single day. My studio was right above his, and I could just hear people talking to that man all day long. I don't know how he got anything done because it was just so many people, thousands of people through there. And being a part, being there to witness that and watch the canoe be made was a pretty special experience. So now I'm the only artist in residence left until winter. And I'm basically given the space to do whatever I want. And I wanted to do something that was kind of specific to Lunenburg. It's place-based. And I also wanted to have a little bit of fun and do something that was different for me. So I decided to, and at the same time, I wanted to continue this exploration of imperial debris in its many different forms. So I started to make an ink out of copper pennies. So I have hundreds and hundreds of copper pennies, and I combine it with vinegar and salt, and I get this beautiful aqua-colored ink. And I've been using that ink to make rust prints, and I'm printing rusted things that I found all about Lunenburg. So I'll walk around town. My friends tease me about this. They call me a scavenger. But I walk around town and I pick up all of the rusted things that I see, and I put them in my pocket, and I take them back to my studio, and I have them collected in this big bowl. And because I do this, I also get other people who contribute rusty things to me. So Wilfred Morris, Senator Wilfred Moore, he's one of the people who started the Lunenburg School of the Arts. He's brought me in rusty things. I've had things shipped to me from other people who know about this project, and they send me rusty things sometimes, and that's always a treat. But I'm using the copper ink, which is vinegar based, and I would normally use vinegar to make a rust print, to make rust prints. So I've created all of these prints that are quite striking from copper and rust, because the copper ink is this beautiful aqua color, and then the rust is, that great sepia kind of, or burnt umber. It's just this very rich, very warm, brownish orange. And they're quite beautiful. And one of the other things about using these materials in this way, and it's meaningful to me as well because I was a goldsmith in the past, so I have a little thing for metal. And I feel like it also comes from being from a steel town. But I definitely have a little thing for metal. And so the idea that I could say copper and rust on paper was really appealing to me, and that's one of the reasons I wanted to do this project. But when I make ink from pennies, it makes the pennies disappear. So and in Canada, we don't use pennies anymore. So pennies are just like currency that isn't in circulation, but it's still hanging around. So in this way, I'm dealing with this imperial debris in this sort of different, useful way. I'm turning it into something else, something that we can actually use because it's not useful anymore. So these pennies disappear. And then the same with the rust. When I put it on the copper ink and leave it for 24 hours and then remove it, it's left behind this residue, this rust residue. And as I do it more and more and more, the material gets thinner and thinner and thinner, and it's disappearing. And I find that kind of exciting. I'm sort of taking this garbage and I'm making it exist in a way that where it's no longer garbage. It's something beautiful. It's something else. And I feel like that's kind of the approach that I've been taking to a lot of different things. And I'm doing that simultaneously. I'm making the salt, and I'm making the ink and making the rust prints all at the same time. And it's kind of become this process art where, it's a little bit at a time. I just work on it a little bit every day, and it becomes bigger and it becomes something else over this process. And through the process, other ideas come, it's just been so lovely to have some time and space. And that's one of my favorite things. I love to do residencies, and my original PhD project that I've been working on, or I'm continuing to work on, came to me when I knew I wanted to do it when I went to Cape Breton, but I was going there for a residency. Visual Arts Nova Scotia had partnered with the Arts Centre in Sydney, and I was given a spot as an artist in residence there, and that time and space really nurtured my PhD work. And so I just love residencies. I think they're so important for artists, and I feel so incredibly privileged every time I get to do one. And my experience at the Lunenburg School of the Arts has been really wonderful. They're incredibly supportive there, and they also give artists other opportunities to teach. So I taught the ink making course, like I mentioned, and I'm going to use my jewelry skills and teach some jewelry classes in the winter, which I'm really looking forward to because I haven't used those skills in about 5 years. And I'll also continue to teach some ink making courses there. My partner is a painter, and he's going to be teaching some oil painting classes there as well. So it's definitely a hub of the community, and it hosts a lot of literary events and music events. Nova Scotia is a very musical place. And here, not here, I'm in Bridgewater right now, but in Lunenburg, there's the Academy, and the Academy building is this incredible structure from the 1800s. I sent you a photo of it. It's very cool. But the bottom floor is the library, and the other floors is a music academy. And so when I get a lift with a librarian from Bridgewater it's about a 20-minute drive, and I don't know how to drive, but it's about a 20-minute drive between Bridgewater and Lunenburg, and I get a lift with my friend Holly, who's a librarian up there. So I go to the Academy. I walk down to the School of the Arts from the Academy, and I walk back to the Academy every evening. And sometimes when I'm outside waiting for Holly in the evening, I'll hear the opera singers practicing upstairs, which is just a treat. I'm really happy to be on the South Shore again. It's a very creative place. There's a lot of artists and musicians around. It's very inspiring. So when I did my first degree at NASCAD, I did a media art degree. So I was mainly doing photography and film, and I did some sound. And I did a minor in art history. I was mostly doing film histories at the time. I had a really strong interest in film. And I had worked in art galleries for a really long time too, so I kind of thought that I would go in that direction to continue to work in art galleries, but it didn't work out that way. So after art school, I didn't have a very firm practice. And I found that I was really looking for an outlet. And my grandfather passed away, and he left me some money. So I decided to sign up for a jewelry course, just for fun. And I signed up for a course with a really fabulous instructor at the Nova Scotia Centre for Craft and Design in Halifax, and he told me I was a natural. So I decided that I was going to give it a try. So I applied to Vancouver Community College, where they have a jewelry art and design diploma. And also, it was on the complete opposite side of the country where I had never been before. So I thought that was an exciting reason to move to the West Coast and spend some time out there. So I lived on the West Coast for 2 years, 2007 to 2009. I did my jewelry making diploma at Vancouver Community College with 2 Polish jewelers and a Canadian female jeweler who specializes in enamel. I had a very thorough jewelry education out there. It was quite tough. But I came back to Nova Scotia with a new skill set, and I really just wanted to focus on making art jewelry because it was an artistic outlet, expressive outlet for me. But this was during the recession, 2009, and so it was really difficult to find any employment. I worked at a watch repair shop for a little while because it was the only place that really could use some of my jewelry skills, my newly acquired jewelry skills. I did a residency first, and I won an award out in Vancouver that gave me a show out there too. So I had some things to work towards. But I decided to start a small business because there was an entrepreneurship program that had recently been developed, and I was working a maternity leave, somebody's maternity leave at NASCAD. A friend of mine was going to have a baby, so I got her job at the NASCAD bookstore for a year. But when it ended, I didn't really have anything lined up. So I signed up for this entrepreneurship program at the Center for Entrepreneurship Education and Development, CEED, C-E-E-D. And I ended up starting a jewelry business there. It was called Angela Grace Jewelry, and I ran it for 7 years. It was fine jewelry for the most part. I did a lot of commissions, and I made sort of like some fashion jewelry too. It was a very popular business, and I had a lot of fun. And I also got to do a lot of travel. I went to the Cannes Film Festival once with my business, but I also made it a point to contribute art jewelry to exhibitions every year because it was really important to me to continue to experiment and to create work that wasn't just for retail. So I ran it until 2015 when I decided to apply for my MFA at NASCAD. I applied through the jewelry department, but because the NASCAD MFA program is interdisciplinary, I knew that I didn't want to continue with just jewelry because for me, the association with the body and having no real separation from the body, it's always got to be body-centric, and somehow was a limit that I wasn't really interested in confining myself with. I really wanted to transfer my skills in some ways and experiment more. So I ended up spending all my time in the sculpture department, where I was a TA for a couple of installation and sculpture courses, and I created my installation practice in this way, in this space. I feel like my goldsmith training really did influence the way that I practice my art. Really still probably does influence the way that I practice my art. Definitely did influence the way I was practicing my art when I was doing my MFA. But I really enjoy that. I think it's really fabulous that I get to have these sort of specialized skills that I can transfer into my art practice. And I sometimes, when I was making jewelry, because you're melting metal with fire and you're using these raw materials to create something completely different, there was a sense of transformation. And in some ways I carried that sense, this transformative sense, into my practice, as well as the technical skills that I learned when I was training as a goldsmith. I'm from a very superstitious family. I believe in ghosts, and so do most of my family members. And so I guess there's this, for me, using the term ghost isn't necessarily literal, even though I do believe in ghosts and spirits. It's more of a symbolic thing. It's a trace. It's a trace of something significant that was left behind. So I feel like I'm using the term ghost in a way where I'm referring to the traces of something, or the residue that has been left behind. So it's kind of a metaphor for me. And I also feel like I have almost like a romantic notion of ghostliness in some ways. So it's aesthetic in some ways for me as well.
You value older things and giving them new meanings.
Mm-hmm. I think that a lot of that comes from not having a lot of money my whole life. You know, I've always purchased secondhand clothing, secondhand objects for my home, secondhand furniture. And the way I feel about those things, you know, even when I had more money, was that anybody can go out and buy something brand new. Anybody can do that. But it's more of a challenge to find something beautiful in a junk shop or in, you know, the Salvation Army or some kind of thrift shop. And I like that challenge. I always called it a treasure hunt. And I also feel like I enjoy simple things and simple beauty. And to me, these old things kind of represent simple beauty. And I like to appreciate them. And I feel like they should be appreciated. These are storied things, and these are things that are useful and are, you know, have value. So I feel like that extends into my art practice as well. It's just kind of a natural extension for me where I think that things can be used in more than one way and that they can have value in different ways, and that, you know, we just have to use our imaginations or be a little bit more thoughtful, and we can see the value in things, in old things, but also in recycled things, which is something I've been collecting, this huge archive of, you know, how to use old wine bottles, for example, things like that. And I find, you know, I remember in a class during my MFA, one of the instructors, Bruce Barber, he asked us what our motto was going to be as artists for the next year or so through our MFA journey. And I said, use what you have. And I think about that all the time now, because I feel like that is what I'm trying to do. You know, I use old mason jars all the time in my art and in my life. And I do feel like I am trying to use the things that I have. And I don't see, you know, the work that's about imperialism or that's talking about imperialism as a negative thing. I see it as a healing thing, because these are issues and things that we must talk about. They've been swept under the rug. We need to come to terms with these things so that we can move on to a more beautiful future. So I think of these things as like, in a way where I associate them with resilience and with hopefulness.
You are a recipient of the governor's gold medal for academic achievement. How does that make you feel?
I was really pleased when I received the medal. It was unexpected, so I was pretty pleased, I guess. I don't think that, I mean, I don't want to act like accolades don't matter at all, because, you know, it's nice to have your work acknowledged. I don't think it's that important, and I don't really think about it that often. But, you know, accolades are things that we put on our CVs, and they help us get more accolades that hopefully have cash attached to them so we can continue our practice. They're kind of like a tool in some ways as well. I feel like in some ways I'm sharing my skills with the public. You know, I'm teaching classes on how to make inks. When I did the terrarium portal here in Bridgewater, where I was encouraging people to get to know their local flora by foraging plants and making terrariums out of them. I feel like, and so I hosted a workshop here in town so that people could participate. in that action if they wanted to. So I feel like, and the foraging work, the foraging walk as well, I feel like in some ways I am sharing my knowledge. I have this idea for a big project, and I've been saving information. I have this huge archive of information that I would like to use to support a project that I would like to apply to the Canada Council for a grant for. And I feel like it's this big, important project, and it will be a way for me to share the knowledge that I have been gathering with other people. And I'm hoping to also create a book to go along with this project, and I don't want to talk about it yet. If it will manifest soon, but it's something inside of me that I know that I really want to do, and I really want to share this information with other people because I feel like it's important, and it's totally tied to everything that I've done so far. It's an extension of that, and it's specifically about survival. Nourish stories. I was doing a seminar in my PhD. It was a seminar specifically about Arsh in the PhD context, and I wanted to talk about food insecurity because that is a portion of deindustrialization that's, it really has an enormous impact on people's lives and their development. And one of the things about growing up in Cape Breton is that the government always said it was the working class lifestyle, specifically diet, that was causing the cancers, the highest cancer rate in the entire country. It was being blamed on people's diets and their lifestyles instead of the toxic waste that was literally in people's backyards. And so I wanted to address that because to me that's not acceptable. You can't blame people's illnesses on them when they're living with toxic waste, and this toxic waste that is just absolutely brimming with carcinogens. You can't do that to people. That is so diminishing. It's gaslighting, essentially. So I felt like, to me, I really wanted to talk about food, and I really wanted to connect some emotions to different objects that have food-related memories connected to them. So a cookbook or a box of beer, or a grocery store bag. These were the kinds of sort of artifacts that I was connecting these stories to. And it just felt important to me to talk about food, to talk about diet, and to talk about nutrition, because it's a deeply classed issue. And I feel like class issues, more than other issues, often get swept under the rug, but they really, really do have a deep impact on people's sense of self. And so it was important to me to create a situation, which was the artwork was the situation, the exhibition of the artwork was the situation where this could be thought about and discussed in a deep way. So that's what I was attempting to do with Nourish. But all of these stories that I've written, I haven't put them together into a book, and I've had many people suggest that I do, and it's something that I think about, and maybe down the road I will. We'll see.